Today is part 3 about the history of the Highway Department. We talked about the formation of the department before and what happened in the 20s and 30s. And today I'm going to talk about the 40s and 50s up through part of the interstate era. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about the interstates because on December 5th, a couple of our former engineers, Bob Champion and Steve Kalogi, are coming in to talk about the interstates, which they were involved with pretty intimately. And so it'll be kind of a question and answer thing too, if you have any questions about things they did or that kind of stuff, that would be a good chance to ask. So I'll just give you kind of the basics of the interstates, and I'll let them really go into a lot more detail. Fred, I know you know both of them, I'm sure. So you guys might remember them as well. So, but anyway, they're very interesting. We had to tell them what not to talk about, and that's always a good sign that they got some good stories to tell. If you have to tell them, don't mention such and such. Anyway, this gentleman is Big George Stein. He was, you remember him? I believe he was our public relations man during the late 50s, early 60s, I think. I always liked George because he's my size, and I can kind of empathize with him. But I always liked this photo too. Apparently they thought a lot of him too. Oh, there we go. Before I get started though, I want to ask you, anybody know what this is? Any guesses? Nope, not a house. It's probably something you don't even expect. No idea?
Start over?
Nope, I haven't said. No, you didn't hear the news that there's going to be a quiz afterwards. This is a wind-powered rock polisher that we found on a highway project down on the East River Road south of Livingston. There's a little log building down there, and it's never been connected up to a commercial power line. It's just been with wind-powered. Tower that's sitting next to it, and the guy used that wind power down the Paradise Valley to polish rocks to sell to tourists who were coming up and down the highway to go to Yellowstone Park or coming home. So I never would have guessed that that's what it was. And I have no idea exactly how it worked, but it must have made a lot of noise while it did. All right, so we'll proceed on. I think I talked the last time about how the Highway Department, there's a continual evolution of how things happen. Evolution in the technology of building roads, evolution in the way that the roads are financed, and evolution in methods of how roads were built. It just gets continually better and better through each decade. In the 1940s and 1950s, it really, I think, it culminated in the Interstate Highway Program, that we really got the system down into how to build roads and bridges. During World War II, though, there was virtually no highway program because the money that we were getting in the 1930s and early 40s to build highways all of a sudden dried up. And it dried up because, of course, the money that we were getting was being converted or sent to the war effort instead. So we allowed the contracts that were already financed to go, but we let no projects up until 1945. What you do see in the Highway Commission records is just stockpiling materials. They'd stockpiled an awful lot of gravel during the war and some other smaller projects, but they did spend some money on projects on strategic highways. And these were highways that the government had decided that had some strategic value in case of a national emergency. The ones that you probably know already, U.S. Highway 10, which became I-90 and I-94, was a strategic highway. U.S. Highway 91 from Butte up to Great Falls was a strategic highway because of the copper refinery up in Great Falls. And U.S. Highway 87 from Wyoming up to Billings was a strategic highway. And then there were some secondary roads that were highways as well, that had some strategic value. One of those, which you wouldn't guess, and I guess this isn't a secondary road, is Montana Highway 78 between Columbus and Absaroka. was a strategic highway. And they did actually do some construction work on that road during the war. Anybody have any idea why that might have been strategic, other than for recreational purposes? Not silver mining, but mining was it. But probably something you don't expect Montana to have. But it had the only reserve of this particular mineral in North America that we knew about, and that's chrome. They needed chrome for aircraft production during the war. So those chrome mines south of Absaroka became very strategic places, especially after the U-boats cut off our supply from South America, or South Africa, excuse me. So secondary highway 419 and 420 in the Stillwater County south of Columbus were also strategic highways. And those were the only places where they spent any money on highway projects during the war. But by 1944, it became obvious to the federal government and to almost every American that we were going to win that war. And so they did actually begin planning for a post-war highway program as soon as the war ended. And Federal Aid Highway Act of 1944 really set the pattern for the way highways would be built during the late 40s and into the 1950s up until 1956. And what it did is it appropriated $1.5 billion to the states for highway construction. That's an incredible amount of money at that time. They never spent anything like that, allocated anything like that to the states in previous highway bills. It created the national system of interstate highways. And that system was based on the old strategic highway network. And so basically the routes of the interstates that we have today were determined in 1944. And so that's, and most of the money that we're going to be spending during the 1950s, at least initially, is going to be spent on that interstate highway system. There's also going to be a big push to really improve the secondary highways as well. So all that work is going to be essentially on the interstate highway network and also on that secondary highway system. There were several studies that were also published during the early 40s and into the 1950s that talked about highway issues. And it turns out the conclusion of almost all of them was that by the end of World War II, most of our highways and most of our bridges were already obsolete. Remember, these are highways and bridges that we mostly just built in the 1930s. And here they were less than 10 years later, they were already obsolete, and they were making plans for upgrading them. So this is going to take an incredible amount of money to do all this. And because it's a boom atmosphere in the U.S. after the war, that money is readily available to the states. So with that, I'll kind of pass the rock polisher. But we did obviously have some problems with Montana's highways after World War II was over with. This is, I don't know where this was taken, but I think probably there was some problems there. Is that a hydraulic problem, Mark? All right. There's another problem. This is on Highway 200 up on the Flathead Reservation around Dixon that we did. I thought when I first saw this that this was one of the highways after the 1959 earthquake. But nope, it had some serious problems as well. So there was some definite danger ahead. What a lot of these reports were saying was that our bridges were too narrow for the highways. So that because of driver expectations, sometimes that our bridges have become hazardous to the traveling public as well. All right, so beginning in 1945, as soon as the war ended, that federal money became available to the states. The Montana Department of Highways, or Highway Department, began letting projects like crazy in the late 40s to kind of make up for lost time, I think. At this time, we provided our matching funds to the for federal funds was through gasoline tax, which we still do today, and then something called a debenture, which is an unsecured bond. It's kind of a loan on future highway earnings or future tax revenues from highways. What they were finding, though, was that this financing stuff is always boring, right? Well, being a historian, that's why I'm not a financier. But Tom, is that a good meal? Is that good for your? I won't tell your wife. So, trying to keep them healthy. Well, anyway, what Montana found was that it had trouble providing enough matching funds for the total federal allocation that we were supposed to get. And that would be a problem that we had all along during the 1940s, 1950s, and even into the interstate highway era, that keeping the finance. Montana, you know, we've got a lot of public lands. We were classified a public land state. We just didn't have the revenue that we needed to provide matching funds for the federal money. A lot of the time, especially during the 1950s, though, that the feds would grant grace periods where you had a certain amount of time to try, that we would give you the money, but you have to try and make that difference up at some point in the future. So anyway, it began crazy busy here at the MDT in the 40s. We started upgrading a lot of the roads that we built in the 1930s, especially those that had strategic value. Defense Highway Network, the interstate highway system at that time. This is on Highway 12 between Garrison and Avon in, I think, 1949. They're working on it. One of the problems I first had here was trying to figure out when exactly a lot of these highways were paved. And generally, I just told people, well, it was probably paved in the 1950s. Well, in fact, it was really paved in the 1930s, but the pavement became a lot better quality in the 1950s. So just some views of some construction equipment at the time. A lot of this stuff I kind of like because OSHA would have a fit if anybody saw any of this today happening. Striper, I kind of like this guy. I mean, this looks like a fun job just to sit in the back of the truck all day and do that. Another version of a striper. Takes a bunch of guys to run those, apparently. I've never been on one. So another views of construction with a drag line shovel and so anyway, if you have any questions, but in the process we were able to build a pretty good road system, you know, modern system that we're used to today. So a lot of the times when you're out on the primary system, you'll be looking at roads that were most likely upgraded during the 1950s. It might be on the alignment of the 1930s, but the upgrades we see come mostly from the 1950s. We also realigned a lot of roads. You know, between here and Townsend, you'll notice there on the east side that there's that old section of highway down there that's now a private road. When you got closer to Wheat, Montana, there's one you can see where the old route went. So if you really look at the landscape around Montana when you're heading out in the field, you can really see how this transportation system changed, mostly during the 1950s. So it is a fairly important time in highway history, and it's something I'm still doing quite a bit of research on and don't have a whole lot to tell you about just yet, but hopefully soon. 1950s was also a time where we built a lot of big bridges. And a lot of those were totally federally funded. There was a big push by the legislature to provide matching funds for those that weren't total federally funded projects. There was quite a bit of controversy about where exactly they would go. Most of them were built across the Yellowstone River, but there was a fair number that were built across the Missouri and the Clark Fork as well. This one, anybody recognize this one? Paula, you should know where this one came from. Yep, this is the Warden Bridge up in Great Falls. This was built in 1951. It's named for a highway commissioner during the 1920s and early 1930s who was also the publisher of the Great Falls Tribune, a guy named O.S. Warden. Warden was a great highway commissioner mainly because he had a lot of personal wealth anyway, so he could go off to Washington, D.C. on his own and lobby for the highway department without using any kind of state funds to do so. He's mostly responsible for the change in how highways were financed in 1926, as he did an awful lot of active lobbying in Washington, D.C. for that change. This is, again, this bridge is really an important bridge as well. You may cross it today and not really think too much about it. But this was the longest bridge in Montana when it was completed in 1951, and it really changed the face of Great Falls. Any idea how? 10th Avenue South was kind of a back road until this bridge was built. And then all of a sudden, 10th Avenue South became a pretty important route in Great Falls, and then you start seeing that migration of commercial businesses down from downtown into down on the 10th Avenue South. So it really has had a significant impact on Great Falls, the construction of this bridge. And what I don't think is really totally very much appreciated. If you look at the old Sanborn fire insurance maps in the early 40s, and you look along 10th Avenue South, it's all residences, except for a few businesses down towards the river. But it's all people who lived in these little houses, all worked at the Anaconda refinery, surprisingly. But it was the culmination of a couple of generations of Montanans who wanted a bridge in central Montana. If you wanted to get across the Missouri River between Fort Benton and Wolf Point, you had to use a ferry to get across the river. So they were really pushing hard through the legislature. They were badgering the Highway Commission for years to get a bridge built, but this department couldn't afford to build it. So they kept putting them off, and they commissioned studies, so they decided where the best places to put the bridge would be and what type. The original idea for this crossing was to have a through truss bridge and not a girder bridge like this one. And but finally, in the early 1950s, someone stumbled upon the fact that, well, the northern end of this bridge is on the Charlie Russell Wildlife Refuge. That's federal land. So guess what? The feds paid for half the bridge, and Montana only had to pay for the other half. So all of a sudden, they quit talking about building a toll bridge, and they started building this bridge. And it took a fair number of years to get it built, the actual construction process. If you go up there today, where the little BLM campground is there off to the southeast side of the bridge, that's where the construction camp was located. And so people were living in this area up here with their families. They had a water system, they had a sewer system, and they were literally in the middle of nowhere. And there weren't even any roads, good roads that went up to the site. So they had to build a road network to get up there as well. But when it opened in 1959, it was really a big deal. And there was thousands of people that showed up for the dedication ceremony. Our governor at that time, a man named Hugo Aronson, the Galloping Swede, was the MC for it and did a lot of speaking. He spoke with that Swedish accent that you hear on TV and you kind of laugh. That's the way he actually sounded when he spoke. And fortunately for us, there's a recording of the dedication ceremony over at the Montana Historical Society, so you can listen to the whole thing. So this really was a big deal when this bridge was completed in 1959, because it really did open up central Montana to some kind of economic development, although it's hard to really believe today, I think. Oops, I keep going the wrong way. Some programs stayed the same during the 1950s. The highway maps started reappearing again in 1946. They didn't print any during World War II because nobody was going anywhere. There was nothing going on, so they didn't publish them then. But in the 1950s, they started publishing them once every year again. The format changed. The map in the center has got a photograph of what the original historical markers looked like, with the words painted on the boards and with the fancy pedestals and all that. And we kept the port of entry program up until 1958. People, again, tourists were encouraged to stop at these places and kind of get information about Montana, and that way they could log in and do some kind of a counting program too to see where people were coming from as far as visiting Montana. This photograph was taken up around Columbia Falls with that port of entry station, and this guy I can't remember his name offhand, but he was there manning this post all by himself. There's supposed to be 2 or 3 guys at this thing, and the other 2 had quit, and this guy spent the summer doing it all by himself. And this was the uniform that they wore. Now, kind of an interesting story is my father was a port of entry attendant in West Yellowstone, and every time I see this photo, I try to imagine my dad dressed up like this. I kind of snicker a little bit, but I don't tell him that when We kept the Highway Historical Marker Program as well from the 1930s. This is the one over at Gold Creek. I believe this is, I'm not sure where this marker is now. I like this photo too. You can see they started routing the text into the boards instead of painting them on like they had before. This reminds me a lot of our vacations when I was a kid. My dad would drive us around, and I think he got tired of us, and he'd just say, "Get out, get out." Make us go read the signs, and we always kind of expected him to drive off and leave us there. He didn't do that, but so this looks very familiar to me. But everything again changes in 1956, and the department had been kind of moving in this direction for 10, 15 years before, and it really kind of gathers momentum during right before World War II and then right after World War II. In June of 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act into law in 1956, and that law, or that act, created the Interstate Highway Program as we know it today. And it allocated money to the states on based on amount of public lands they had within their borders. Montana was a public land state, so I believe we only paid about 6% of the cost of the interstates. Places that weren't public land states, like back east, I think they paid more like 9% of the cost. So Montana really got off pretty well with this, and it allocated, I don't remember how much money. I forgot to write that down, but they anticipated that it would cost something like oh God, I got to apologize for this. The system was supposed to be completed by 1972. But as you know how this place works, right? And other highway departments work the same way, that they kept extending that period out. So I believe that they anticipated that it would be finished sometime around 1990. So I like the way this works. You can always, more things change, the more some things stay the same. Montana, the period that we built interstates lasted from 1959 to 1988. The first section of interstate built was between Oneida and Lima on Interstate 15. They let the contract in the spring of 1958. Construction began that next year, and I don't remember exactly when it was completed, but then you see increasingly more and more interstate contracts let after that. There is some argument about exactly where the first interstate project was that we did let. This was the first, according to the Highway Commission records. But another one that's a close second is down around Crow Agency on I-90. That was let the month after this one was. So both projects are kind of being built at the same time, but one south of Dillon is the first. Anybody know where the last section was built? Yep, just south of Dillon. And where the most expensive section of interstate was? Pardon? Nope.
Basin.
Yep, Boulder down to Butte was the most expensive section. And I can see that. I remember having to drive through that enough that I cursed it quite a bit. But a lot of the most expensive sections of interstate were built in the early 1960s. And you might remember some of these. Wolf Creek Canyon, Prickly Pear Canyon was expensive. It was also a major engineering feat constructing that road in there and keeping traffic moving through there at the same time. Also caused a lot of political issues, because how many of you heard the stories about Butte being, the reason why Interstate 15 goes through Butte is because of political reasons? Well, that's not quite true. But But there was a lot of politics involved in the specific routes of the interstates. Wolf Creek Canyon was actually one of 3 choices that they had to build I-15. There was another one that went way up over towards Gates of the Mountains and kind of came out more down through Hauser Lake, or not Hauser, Holter Lake. There was two alternatives through Wolf Creek Canyon. There was one route, and then there was a middle route, and I believe they chose the middle route through the canyon. Bob Champion can tell you all kinds of things about that one. But it was an expensive project. They had to keep the traffic moving. They had environmental issues they had to deal with as far as the fisheries on Little Prickly Pear Creek. So we tried to remedy that by creating or improving the fishery through there as we were building the road. And then there was a controversy about whether you keep the old road open after the interstate is completed. So that road through the canyon, according to the Highway Commission and some of the other records that I've seen, was kept open mostly for the recreationalists, so they would have access to Little Prickly Pear Creek. So all that's very interesting stuff. On the Interstate Highway Program very early, we're dealing with environmental issues when we don't really have to at that time. There are no real laws that say you have to take that into account as you're building this interstate. There was a legislator from Livingston area named Ben Stein that didn't like the route that they were working on. So we built the road through the southern end of the canyon, and then Ben Stein, who was a legislator in 1963, tries to stop the whole thing. Says, you should have gone with this other route that goes through Holter Lake, not through here, because you're destroying the scenic beauty of the canyon. You're also destroying these fisheries. And so we'd already spent $4 million building it through the southern end of the canyon. And he expected us to just, abandon it essentially and then build this new route. The dynamics between him and the chief engineer at that time, a guy named Fred Quinnell, is very interesting because they hated each other. And there's a great photograph, and I wanted to have him put it in my Interstate Highway articles in Montana, the magazine of Western History, that shows Ben Stein sitting at Fred Quinnell's desk. And apparently Quinnell had a big picture of Ben Stein hanging on his wall, and he threw darts at it. And Stein would keep showing up. He'd show up at the public hearings. You had to have public hearings on interstate projects. I think you just had to have one, and that was basically, as far as I can tell from the records, is that you told these people, this is where the road's going, what do you think about it? I mean, there was really not much latitude for making a whole lot of changes. The decisions have been made. You just was informative. You're just kind of informing the public. That would change in the late 60s, where they got more of an input in how things actually played out. So it's very interesting in the early interstate period to really watch the dynamics. When you travel I-90 down between Mission Interchange and Springdale, that was a big issue too. At that time, they designed interstates on the best routes. Correct? Makes a lot of sense. That's what we do here. And unfortunately, those routes went right through the center of Yellowstone Valley. So what happens when you're trying to get right-of-way? It becomes a big headache because you have to condemn a lot of land to build your road. And that's not really something we wanted to do because it slows down the project. You build a lot of hard feelings with the local landowners, most of whom liked the idea of the interstate. They just didn't want it going right down the middle of the valley because it was taking out a lot of the good agricultural land. So there was a big stink in the legislature about that. There's a feature down there when you come out of the canyon when you're heading up towards Springdale that's called the Springdale Cut. And I point this out to my wife all the time, and she could care less, but I think it's a pretty interesting thing. But that was a major political issue, building that. We took a lot of heat for that particular feature on the interstate. So there's a lot going on. Most of the interstate's built on new alignment. It requires new right-of-way that a lot of people don't want to give up. A lot of people in Montana had absolutely no concept about what a controlled access road was. So not even, according to Steve Cologi, a lot of the engineers didn't have a good concept of it. And he says it was a big headache too, because you get people who wanted access. Okay, well, you know, we'll sell you land, but we want access to the highway. Well, you have to tell them, well, the access is 5 miles down the road, and they didn't like that. And, so in the early 60s, Lewis Chittum took over as the head of the Right-of-Way Bureau, and he said it was the biggest mistake he ever made in his life. Which, I don't know, did you work with Lou?
Yeah, I knew. That was my. Actually, I didn't work for him.
Lucky you, I think. You know, Lou Chittum, if you see him in these old photographs, he's always smiling, and he looks like this great guy. But when I met him, I thought, when I got out, I was glad I didn't have to work for that guy. I mean, he was a taskmaster. He expected you to do your best job and do it right the first time. So in the early 60s, he became the new chief engineer, and he came up with this new idea. He says, well, why are we building our roads right down the center of the valleys? That's stupid, because it's causing us all these right-of-way issues. So then he made it so that they started designing roads so they are on the bluffs, on the edges of the valley. So if you drive down east of Billings, you'll notice a lot of the interstate is built outside of where the farmland and ranch land is. And that's all because of Lewis Chittum making that decision. So that was a major decision that the department made at that time. And it did help as far as the right-of-way goes. It's a lot easier to buy right-of-way in land that's really not very productive than it is in land that isn't. Homestake Pass was built in the early 1960s. All totally new road. There was no road over that pass. There was a railroad, but no vehicular road. So the engineers had to go out, and the surveyors had to go out and plot out a brand new highway. And there's $1 million cut along that route. You know, where it's, I don't remember, it's 200 feet high, and I don't remember how many feet long, but it's a major engineering feature on that route, on a new alignment. But we had absolutely no right-of-way problems on that one, because it was all Forest Service land. So it was pretty easy to deal with that issue on Homestake. But when Homestake Pass project was let in 1964, I believe, that at that time it was the most expensive project the department had ever let to contract. I believe it was around $6 million. So this is a lot of big bucks, right? So I was kind of liking this whole period. Must have been kind of exciting to be an engineer. I mean, you knew the interstate system was going to be completed, so you were going to get the money to do it. I mean, you may not get everything you want, but you're going to, we have to finish the system. It was very heady time for the department during the interstate period. And they had to hire lots of new engineers, new surveyors, the whole works to build these things. And I guess they were raiding other companies to get surveyors and designers for the interstates. We finally had to start contracting with consultants to design highways. And the very first highway consultant that we got was, surprise, surprise, Morrison Mayerly. And they designed and did a lot of the legwork for the Wolf Creek Canyon project in the early 60s. So, so a lot of the records that I looked at for that project I got from the archives of Morrison Mayerly, because he'd done all that work before. So it's a very exciting time, the interstate thing. We originally designed them as 2-lane controlled access routes. Montana was a rural state. They were only looking at designing 4 lanes around the metropolitan areas like Billings, Helena, Missoula, Butte, Miles City. But in 1966, they made the decision to convert all the 2-lane interstates to 4-lane. So essentially, you got a pretty good start on all this interstate. Then you get to go back and add another 2 lanes. And so it was really, I think, it must have been a pretty exciting time. And it's a time that's a lot different than it is today. I mean, it's not hampered by the same kind of, I put this correctly since I work in environmental services. I don't know how to put this nicely so that I don't get fired. We didn't care. You know, they made some provisions along the Clark Fork River with I-90 to avoid impacting the river as much as possible. But it isn't really until the mid-'60s, late '60s, and into the '70s, especially after NEPA was passed in 1970, that we have to start really taking the environment into account when we design these things. And so, you know, when I first started here in 1990, I worked a lot with the old engineers who worked on the interstates, and I remember how much they hated the environmental stuff. And I mean, it was tough. They were tough guys to deal with, including Steve Kalogi and Bob Champion. And, you know, but after, in retrospect, I can kind of understand why, because when they were really, in their younger days working at the department, they didn't have to pay attention to that kind of stuff. They just built the best highway that they could. And well, if you have to move the creek, then move the creek. You know, type of stuff. There's a historic building next to the route. Well, that's okay. It's old anyway, and we can get rid of it. So it must have been a pretty exciting time, I think. The system pretty much progressed at a pretty regular pace from 1959 up until 1988. There were some funding shortfalls, so that might scale back the program for the following year, fiscal year occasionally, but not a whole lot. They did go back and they did add 2 lanes on to a lot of roads. Some of you might remember, which I remember, coming back to Helena from Butte on I-15, and it was just a 2-lane route in 1969. So, I mean, that really kept the whole program moving as well. Again, the most expensive section was between Butte and Boulder, and the last section that was built was just about 7 miles south of Dillon. Ironically, on I-15 in about the same general area as the first project was lit. Now, I'm not sure exactly how much it cost yet. This is the big side cut. There's the crazy mountains in the background, working on that. I know you'll all be paying attention, looking for that next time you go to Billings, pointing it out to your wives or whatever, and get their disinterest as well. Wolf Creek Canyon had to move a lot of rock. They had to do a lot of dynamiting in the canyon to get the rock out of the way. So the highway was closed for good portions of the week while the construction was going on. They always said in the newspaper, well, we won't keep them for longer than a half hour or an hour. But there were sometimes they were closed for the whole day. And then, of course, what that generates is a lot of angry letters to the editor of the Helena Independent Record about how they've closed the road and they can't get through. But it was all for a good cause. Another view of it with the, looks like the railroad right down there below it. But you can see off to the one side where there's a private car coming through as well. So you had to keep that open and also clear out all that rock to build a 4-lane highway. Another view of it. Out more, and I'm not sure exactly where this was taken, but you know, a tremendous amount of earth was moved to build these things. And of course, it took a lot of concrete, a lot of asphalt, a lot of chip sealing, that type of thing as well. So, and it was a very methodical approach to doing it that was really down to a fine art there by the end of the system. And I like the guy there in the middle because he sure is working hard as well. But, you know, I'm going to tell this joke. When I first started here, I rode up in the elevator with a bunch of guys, and I didn't know anybody yet, really. And so I told somebody I knew there, I says, well, I could tell I drove through a highway department project. I says, there was 4 guys standing around and 1 guy working. And I kind of laughed, and nobody else was laughing. But here's a good example. 2 guys just kind of stand around and 1 guy working. It's just the way things are. And my history professor at MSU, after he found out I got this job, he says, well, what's orange and sleeps for? I says, I don't know. He says, a highway department van. I tried to prove him wrong after that. Another view of the construction. How many of you remember when the interstates were being built around Montana? It was pretty impressive. You know, watching them when that process was going on. Here's a good example up between Ulm and Cascade, where it was originally designed as a 2-lane controlled access interstate, and then they went back and they added in another 2 lanes to that to make it a 4-lane route. And one of the areas, first areas they did that was up between Ulm and Cascade. Great Falls, of course, at that time was the state's biggest city, and because of the air base and the copper refinery, it was really took precedent over some of the other. Any idea what other big cities got interstates very early on? Kind of makes sense. Bill, you're going to say it, I know.
Missoula?
Billings. Billings got interstates very early in its history, during the program as well. A lot of the reason for that was because of the oil refineries down there. And let's see, that might be the Cloverleaf here at Helena. See if you can spot where the MDT building is today. Yep, I remember Favre's over there. So this is, I think the department was down in that lower left corner down there. But yeah, it's hard to believe now when you look in Helena that this is what it looked like out in the east at the Capitol Interchange. And I think it's a lot more efficient now than it was when they designed it. I mean, I don't think a lot of the times they anticipated increasing traffic on these, and in fact they were supposed to design these highways for what expected traffic counts in the 1970s. But of course a lot of the times then that meant that some highways were designed already obsolete, and they had to go back and fix them, and I believe we're kind of fixing some of those things today. This is the bridge that we're going to replace over the tracks there on the north, just to the north of here on I-15, looking south towards where the Cloverleaf would be. It's hard to look at this too and not notice how much it's changed in Helena as well. And that's all I've got. As far as the total cost of building the interstates in Montana, I'm seeing anywhere around $600 million to $1.2 billion. So I'm hoping to get a better grasp on exactly how much it costs to build the interstates. But $1.2 billion seems a little high to me. But $600 million seems a little bit low. So I'm thinking the actual amount is somewhere there in between. Part of the result of the interstate program is this building we're sitting in as well. You know, we outgrew where the former highway department building was there by the Capitol, and so they looked out here. And this was actually the first choice for a site for the building. And I believe it was finished in the late 70s, early 80s. 76. I remember it was here when I was still in high school, but I don't remember a whole lot of the details of construction. I was more interested in the drive-in theater across the street over there. So anyway, with that, the next talk will be on bridges. But if you have any questions, I'd be more than willing to try and answer them. Renee.
With today's regulations, would you be able to put interstate between Boulder and Bernice South?
Can I be quite honest?
Yeah.
I think we'd have trouble building the interstates anywhere in the state now if we tried to do it. That the environmental regulations and other regulations are pretty tight, tough, and I think it would be hard to build an interstate in Montana at this point. But yeah, I think, you know, when they built that section between Boulder and Basin, they did take environmental issues into account, and that's what I think. Well, it made the price go up, but I think we got a much better looking interstate out of it as well. It seems, you know, before when they built roads, the roads kind of conformed to the landscape. And if you kind of follow those, you can kind of see that. So when you get to the interstates, to maintain the standards of 70 mile per hour design speed, I mean, you had to make the landscape conform to the interstates. And but I think that section through the canyon there by Basin is a good example of slowing it down a little bit and building something that looks pretty good. So another question.
Is it also true that with the Eisenhower signing for the interstate that for every 5 miles of highway, federally funded highway, you had to have a straight stretch long enough to land an airplane?
No. I used to think that. And I'd tell my students when they'd ask guys, yeah, that's true. But I've done a lot of research on the interstate since then. And according to the chief guy at Federal Highways for the Bureau of Public Roads in the 50s, that The interstates weren't designed for military purposes. They were designed for commercial purposes. And so, yes, they had to make some changes on highway overpasses, especially in the west, so that they could get missiles underneath. They had to raise them up a little bit so they could get missiles underneath the overpasses. But that stuff with every 5 miles, no. They tried that. Very early in the program, they were going to try and incorporate that in, but found out that it really wasn't very practical. And so I don't know if you could land a jet on some of those, fighter jet or something on some of them. So while the German Autobahns were designed to, to facilitate the movement of troops and supplies across Germany in the 1930s and 40s, that the interstates here were designed mostly for commercial purposes. And the military part of it was secondary. I mean, it would help if there was a nuclear war, if you needed to get people out of Los Angeles quick. Well, maybe that's not a good example. But if you needed to get people out of the metropolitan areas quickly, that also, I'm kind of going ad-libbing now, but the interstates are also responsible for the National Historic Preservation Act. That is the thing I've been working under for my career here. That there was a real concern that the interstates in the 60s were lacking too many historic places. And so that was one of the reasons for the act, was to try and find some way to avoid impacting historic buildings. Section 4F, Tom, is a product of the interstate program, trying to make sure that we didn't unnecessarily destroy the inner cities too much, so that, so people, well, that's part of it, but also the city parks and that, to try and avoid those areas as much as possible with the interstate. The interstates took a terrible toll on the inner cities back east, and of course that's where the minorities lived, and all this, that's where the social justice issues come out now, I think, in our environmental process. So, am I getting it right, Fred? All right. So, any other questions? Scott?
Yeah, you kind of alluded to the fact that the location of the interstate between Helena and Butte is not a political decision. Care to expand on that? Or?
Well, I'd always heard that the only reason why I-15 went through Butte was because Senator Mike Mansfield pretty much said it's going to go through Butte. Have you all heard that story? I think a lot of you probably have. They did scout out some alternate routes for the interstate that took off south of Boulder. There's a couple of passes down there, Nez Perce Pass, and there's another one, I can't remember the name of it. And it would have connected with I-90 at a point where it would have gone right down to Dillon, or else it could have gone, junctioned with I-90 and then went into Butte. Well, I asked Bob Champion and Steve Kology about that, and I asked Bill Dunbar, who worked for the Federal Highway Administration, about it, and Dave Johnson, who used to work here, and says, was it a political decision to put the interstate where it's at? And they said, good God, no. I mean, they said there was no good option. That it was going to be expensive no matter what they did, and they figured that really the best route was the route that I-15 is on today. And that's why it's there, and it's not there because of any kind of a political decision. Although it obviously would have made the politicians happy that they were going to go that route. But, so that's why it's there. It was an engineering decision and not a political decision, according to the engineers who were here at the time. I'm going to go with what they say. But it does make a good story.
Do you have anything on the completion of Highway 200? Because I was in Ovando when that was completed.
Well, it became Montana Highway 200 in the 70s, was it early 70s? I think.
70s, yeah.
Before that, it was the Central Montana Highway. And
I know it was a struggle.
It was a struggle. I remember reading in the 30s that there was a lot of people put off that the department wasn't spending any money to improve it through Central Montana. Western Montana, I don't know a whole lot about. But I would imagine it was kind of an well, a lot of it would have been built by the Federal Highway Administration anyway.
I think so. I remember that they even put on a big buffalo feed in Ovando and had people from all over the state coming there.
Yeah.
It was completed, so I kind of was involved.
Well, you know, I was not going to mention this, and I should have included a couple of photos. I kind of talked about it, Mrs. Walsh. In the early 70s, I don't know exactly why they did this. They initiated a Miss Montana Highways program. And what would happen is that engineers from all the districts and here in Helena, they would nominate young women, in one case an old woman, who worked for them as Miss Montana Highways. And of course, our visions of beauty have changed quite a bit since then. But God, there was one of them that was really hot. And so she brought her picture, and she was pretty hot. But they're mostly, well, of course, at that time, there are no female engineers, right? So these are all women or typists and secretaries and that type of thing, and they're all pretty young. They all wore mini skirts for the most part. And you know, I remember what this place was like in the early 90s. I can kind of imagine what it was like in the early 70s. And they would elect her, you know, and they would have a panel, and Louis Chittum would be on the panel, and Jack Walsh was the MC, and I imagine he was a pretty good MC on these things too. And they would elect Miss Montana Highways, and there was 4 of them. My favorite one's name is Buttons LaSalle, because I keep thinking of a stripper for some reason. And that person, she had to keep a regular job, but that person was essentially eye candy when they went out and dedicated sections of interstate. Because every section they completed, they had a dedication ceremony, and the person cutting the ribbon was Miss Montana Highways. And she would represent the department at other functions, and she served for a year, and then they'd bring somebody else in. They only did that for 3 years. So one Miss Montana Highways resigned to go back to school, and they got another one, so that's why there was 4. But then they quickly dumped it. And I keep thinking, in the back of my mind, what would happen if we tried to do that today? I think we wouldn't get very far. And, Miss Montana Highways was a big deal. And so across the street, I got a file that's got all, for the first year, that's got all the reasons why you should elect this woman. I include a picture, and I think the picture was taken here by the department as well, because they're all the same size and backgrounds and everything. And we'll say, you know, she's very comely and has nice legs. And I thought, oh God, this would be an HR nightmare if we were trying to do anything like this again. But it is kind of an exciting little aside, or interesting aside in our history that we used to do that. I'm not sure when the first female engineer was hired here, but I assume that Leslie Tribblehorn was probably one of the first. And she's still here today, of course. Louise, you've been here a while. I know you've been here as long as I have, at least. So. Really? All right.
There was some before Leslie.
Was there some?
Yeah.
Not very many, I would imagine.
Gosh.
So we'd sure like to get...
She started her own business back. Who was her?
Sure.
Walker.
That's somebody we'd like to get in touch with, I think, at some point.
She has a consulting firm.
Is she? Yeah. I know Leslie was one of the first. She's been here a long time. So, any other questions?
I think I started working on the bridge here.
Well,
No, that's 16.
so a while yet. 2016? That's going to be a big project when that happens.
Right in that here.
Yeah. Is that one of your projects, Dave?
Actually, I think Mark's running that.
Vicky is. All right.
Yeah.
That was an expensive project. That was a pretty good-sized bridge at the time. It's going to be even bigger now. So, any other questions?
Is there ever any scandal corruption in the department?
You know, I was going to talk about that. There was. And of course, that's when my boss leaves. That looks a little bad, Tom. Just kidding. Just kidding. In 1949, we had a governor named John Bonner. And John Bonner had started in state government as the head of the right-of-way bureau here, or right-of-way section here at the department in the late 20s. So John Bonner knew all about how the department operated, or so he thought. Well, John Bonner didn't like the highway commissioners. There was, I think, 5 of them at that time. And he especially didn't like the chairman, a guy named Lee Ford. And so what John Bonner started to do was go to meetings about highways without inviting the highway commissioners. And then he would come back and tell them what they talked about and what decisions he made. And so it kind of developed into an issue of how much control should the governor have over the highway commission. Should he be telling us what to do like this, or is it something we should be doing different, or we should be doing it the way we have been before? So that caused a big flap between the highway commission and John Bonner, to the point where they were barely speaking to each other at all. But Bonner was still sticking his nose in our business. Excuse me. And then it kind of came to a head. We had the commission secretary was a man named William O. Whips. And he was kind of a volatile personality. He'd been the secretary since, I think, the early 30s, late 20s. He had, at least on one occasion, been granted a leave of absence because he'd had a nervous breakdown. And it was determined that the highway commission, or the highway department building over there at 6th and Roberts, needed new windows because it was drafty. And of course, this was in 1949 before the interstate program got going. So Whips took that request to the highway commissioners, and we need 110 new windows for this building, and the highway commission gave him verbal okay to go do it. So Whips went and he got the most expensive windows you could buy. And then someone complained. And the governor found out. The governor says, you have to fire him. And Lee Ford, who was the head of the commission, says, no, we don't. You don't tell us who to hire and fire. We make that decision. And then it comes out, it makes the newspapers, this spat between the two. And it comes out that William Whips is actually another HR nightmare. He kind of lords over the department because he's been there a long time. He verbally badgers men and women who work here, abuses them verbally with coarse language, it said in the newspaper, and he carried a loaded pistol in his desk. So of course then they're kind of afraid of him too, right? Not only are you going to get an ass chewing, essentially, you might get shot in the process. So there was a big flap about whether the governor had the right to tell the commission to fire Whips. And the commission said, no, that's our responsibility. We're not going to do it. And so what did the governor do, you think? Fired the highway commission. He got rid of them all. And he fired Whips. The new commission came in and sacked Whips. So it's not really a matter of corruption. It's a matter of, somebody who knew a lot about how the department operated becoming governor and trying to do things his way when actually he didn't have the legal authority to do that. Does that kind of answer it? Corruption, there was a movement, I believe, in the early 70s by Representative Blatnick. I think I knew one of his grandkids at one point, that was saying that the contractors were taking advantage of the highway departments, or else the departments were working in collusion with the highway contractors to pay too much for these highway projects. And so it wasn't, right for the taxpayers for this to continue. And they determined that, yeah, in some eastern states that was happening, but Montana came out clean as a whistle on it. So I guess that would be the closest thing to any kind of corruption. I mean, it must have been really tempting though, because there's millions of dollars available that we hadn't had before, and to have control of that, it must have been kind of an interesting thing. Yes, sir.
Speaking of other states, when the interstate came to bordering states, Did the two states work together to try to keep the highway,
Well,
keep it intact?
yes. Fortunately, most of those projects were, very close, like Lookout Pass. I mean, there's nowhere else for the road to go, so that's easy. Weebo, I believe it was pretty easy. So, yeah, the other states kind of, according to Bob Champion, though, sometimes there was differences in opinions. He said we just blew them off. Did what we wanted to do anyway. So, I like Bob. I would have liked to have worked for him. It would have been. Although I like working for Bill Simmons and Tom Martin too. So, anyway, any other questions? That was a little, schmoozing there, so. In case anybody's in line for a raise. So with that, I think that'll be it. Next time we'll talk about historic buildings. Hope to see you on December 5th. Thank you.